Hi, this is Paul. This is the conversation between Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins, and this conversation, at least in terms of early listeners, has gotten extremely mixed reviews from people that I've asked about it on Twitter. Some people said, oh, you should definitely listen to it. A number of other people, and people who are very much Jordan Peterson fans, basically said, no, it's a waste of time. I did not find this conversation a waste of time. Now, there's a bunch of things about this conversation that, let's say, as a conversation, it's not a great one. I think this happened when Jordan was in Oxford. The whole setting indicates that. He seemed very excited to talk to Richard Dawkins, which means he didn't do a lot of listening. In fact, somewhere in the middle of the conversation, he basically admits, well, I haven't let you do enough talking. But then he goes on to not let Richard Dawkins do enough talking. And Dawkins was very patient with him, which I think was lovely. But there's a lot of stuff in this conversation that is, well, it's worth it partly because you can watch exactly what Peterson is wrestling with respect to many of these questions that are right now sort of at the center of the conversation with respect to religion and rationality and ontology, very much in the line of the videos that I released quite recently of John Vervaeke's conversation with Lantern Jack and Wolfgang Smith's conversation with on the meaning code. And as I listened to this, I thought in many ways this conversation makes more sense if you start at the end of it and move towards the front of it. And I think you'll see what I mean. Now, right here at the end, when time runs out, a little alarm goes off, and Richard Dawkins is like, well, I'm out of here. And well, let's just dive in there.
I want to ask you one final question. I know we're running out of time, but I don't care. I want to ask you this question. Okay. I talked to Sam Harris. I've talked to Sam Harris 5 times. And the first time I talked to him, I was extremely ill. And we got bogged down in a discussion of truth. Pragmatism versus objective. Something we've been bandying that back and forth, and it's a tough nut to crack. And then we had 4 more discussions that were all public, and there was a tremendous amount of interest in them, which was quite stunning. It was staggering. We had 10,000 people in Dublin to one, and about the same to the O in London, and we were discussing issues just like this, And I made some mistakes dealing with Sam because I had a point I wanted to make, and it was, I suppose, the point of this pragmatism in some sense in its relationship to evolutionary biology. And so I was trying to sort of win the argument. And I have found, as a consequence, let's say, of a baptism by fire, that that's not a good way to approach. Like, one of the things I really wanted to do with you, I hope we managed this today, was
now right there, what we're gonna one of the well, I don't know, maybe I should play this little clip first before we get into it, because it's so central to, I think, seeing something in this conversation.
I mean, for example, if you have a quantum particle, it will not be located in general in any particular point in space. In fact, there's a probability that it is given any 2 regions in space, there's a certain probability that the particle is in that region.
Okay, now, if you watch the whole Peterson Dawkins, Peterson will mention, he actually gets the title wrong in the video, The Metaphysical Club, which is a book that he recommended a long time ago. It's really a fascinating book. After he mentioned it, I picked it up, I read it. Talks about Charles Peirce and the advent. Charles Peirce was basically trying to figure out how stars could be located when the instruments were insufficient at the time to locate stars. And Peirce developed the mathematics of statistics and probability. And that's what is used. Now, here again, Wolfgang Smith talks about that physicists via math can talk about the probability of the location of a particle, but he's going to go into the question of measurement again.
So these quantum particles are very, very strange entities. You can't really conceive of them except in mathematical terms. But what puzzled physicists is that when they make a measurement in an instant, as it were, this particle, instead of being spread out over vast regions of space, obtains a particular position.
So in other words, the influence of measuring or attention or observation impacts the particle, the location of the particle.
The measured particle is in a given place and time. And so this is something that puzzled the physicists. How is it possible for an act of measurement to collapse this probability wave and give a definite position to particles which have no definite positions before the act of measurement? And believe it or not, physicists have been kicking this so-called measurement problem around for a good 100 years, almost, more like 90. For about 90 years, they've been speculating on this with no actual solution in sight. The weirdest ideas are presented by them in order to resolve this conundrum, but I believe it's still an open question in the physics world. So this is what got me into thinking about quantum mechanics, and I came to a very simple conclusion. The reason measurement is not comprehensible to the physicist is that the measuring instrument itself is not really a physical thing. It is not the kind of thing that the physicist studies or describes in his equations.
The measuring thing itself is not a part of, let's say, the level of physics. All right? The measuring thing itself is above the level of physics because it comes from above and looks down upon it in order to make the measurement. That's key. This is almost identical to Brett Weinstein, what he says about, well, you have this genetic code that's running around, but you can deny your code by virtue of consciousness. All right? By virtue of consciousness, you can deny your code, because what happens with consciousness, this is sort of Pageauian language from the Brett Weinstein talk, you kind of come above and you look down, and this is analogous to this measurement. It's observation, it's selection, it's relevance realization. Now, Vervaeke will come up in Peterson's conversation with Dawkins in a little clip a little bit earlier, because remember, I went to the end. Now I'm going to go back to other places. But think about it this way again. It's to measure something. In a sense, you transcend out of the thing to look at it with a thing separate from itself in order to evaluate it. That's in very many ways connected to the question, the frame problem, and the question of frames. So keeping that in mind, continue to listen to Peterson and Dawkins.
To ask you questions and find out more about what you thought, like in a real genuine manner, not to win any of that, none of that. The last time I talked to Sam...
Now, in a sense, what Peterson is saying in terms of his mode of conversation is that this measurement that he wished to, in a sense, impose upon his conversation partner distorted the conversation. We can understand that in a rhetorical sense. We can understand that in a relational sense. But what he's doing is realizing, in a sense, the frame that he was using to pursue the conversation. And he had a sense that that was a lesser frame than the one in which he's trying to pursue in this case.
All I did was ask him questions. And we had by far the best discussion we've ever had.
Okay.
And so through that discussion, I was alerted to reasons why he was so antipathetic to the idea of religion.
Okay.
And so I thought so Sam is very obsessed with the idea of totalitarian atrocity. I would say evil, fundamentally, if you wanted to make it metaphysical. But you could say restrictive dogmatic tribalism of the sort that makes us demonize and destroy people, ideas, institutions.
My alarm, by the way, for 6 o'clock.
So two things happen there. Number one, I think Peterson rightly sees what's at the heart of motivating Sam Harris. And as Peterson says, it's a good motivation. the world has been filled with atrocities. Religious motivations have often come to the fore. And so, well, Sam's idea is to sort of, well, maybe you can, if you get rid of religious motivations, you can get rid of the atrocities. It's a good motive. And then right at this point, Richard Dawkins' alarm goes off, and it's time to quit. I'm going to back away from this guy. But of course, Peterson's going to hang on to him for another 7 minutes until someone comes to fetch Richard Dawkins.
But so, what is it you want to ask me? Because we have run out of time.
And now we're an hour 20 minutes into this, and well, okay. So you wanted to ask me something. You've been talking at me for an hour and 20 minutes. What exactly is it that you want to ask me?
I want to ask you, when you talk about religion,
Yes.
do you identify the religious impulse, let's say, or even the religious phenomena, with the totalitarian proclivity for dogmatic certainty and the potential acceleration of aggression and atrocity as a consequence?
So he basically asks him, well, are you like Sam Harris in this? Do you think that's the problem with religion?
No.
There's the answer. No. Oh, I guess we got to wrap this up in 2 minutes, but it's a good thing we didn't.
I care first and foremost about scientific truth. And so to me, it is an...
Now, this is where he's going to get into, well, I care first and foremost about scientific truth. Okay, so now we've really located Richard Dawkins as sort of a modernist. This is his worldview, and this is what he cares first. But this question of what on earth we mean by truth, that's really, again, what a lot of this conversation is about.
It is a scientific question whether there is a supernatural power, creative power, intelligence in the universe. I think that's a very fascinating question. I think that if that were true, it would be the most important scientific truth if there is. That would be...
Now that's an amazing statement from Richard Dawkins. Now, part of the difficulty that he has is exactly the same difficulty that Brett Weinstein had in that video that I played, where he's having a number of years ago now a conversation with Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Peugeot, where Brett Weinstein basically says that the scientific method is the method by which we judge all truth. The problem is you can't even, as Vervaeke points out often, you can't evaluate the veracity of the scientific method by its own standard. You need another standard with which to evaluate it, and you can't use that one. This point has been made innumerable times, and it just sort of goes over most people's heads as it goes over Richard Dawkins' head. And in many ways, this is the question that Peterson pursues through this conversation. Again, this is sort of a lousy conversation, but there are some really nice little nugget speeches by Peterson in this video.
It would be a fundamentally different kind of universe that we live in if there is a creative intelligence.
Okay, now, that of course is his conclusion, but how on earth will you answer that question by science? And in many ways, if you look at, again, Vervaeke's 4 Ps, you really only get at most of those questions, these questions of fittedness, by your other Ps, by your participatory, by your procedural, by your perspectival. You're not going to get at the question scientifically. You can't put the universe, in a sense, into the test tube in that way. I've been reading C.S. Lewis's Miracles again, and Lewis makes this kind of point again and again through the book.
So although I have a secondary interest in negative consequences of religion and so on, especially in Islam, my my fundamental interest is in the scientific truth, which I believe is a scientific question, even if it can't be answered by scientific means.
So at least he acknowledges that, but I don't think it's fundamentally a scientific question.
There either is a God or there isn't, and that there either is a creator or not at the base of the universe, an intelligence. I think there's not. I think that intelligence is something that comes late into the universe as a consequence of a long evolutionary process. It happens.
Okay, so intelligence comes late in the universe. Okay, well, what do you mean by intelligence? Now, I think basically what he means by intelligence is the ability to pursue a telos, a purpose, an outcome intentionally with agency and power. Now, I'm preparing for Synod. That's why I'm not putting out videos at the rate that I usually do. And I found out that I have to have an hour of, somebody has to sit and school me about power for an hour. And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking that that's such a lousy word to use, because what we're really talking about is this capacity to consciously, with intentionality, pursue a desired outcome using the agency and the resources, and marshaling agencies and resources that we can colonize and employ. That's really what we're talking about here. And basically, Richard Dawkins looks around and says, I don't think the universe as it is constituted now is the product of such a being. The difficult question that you have, of course, is, and this is exactly what Lewis deals with in his book Miracles, where do you get the capacity to not only pursue this, but to recognize that you are pursuing this and to measure your own accomplishments in pursuing this? That's just an emergent property, and Lewis makes the point, as does Alvin Plantinga, as has many people throughout the 20th century. If this is merely a product of chaos or irrationality devoid of this capacity, then even the pursuit, the intentional, willful, purposive pursuit, call it rationality, call it design, that is undermined. Lewis makes that point again and again. Alvin Plantinga makes that point. Dawkins simply says, we have this capacity. And he's right. We do have this capacity. But where does that capacity come from? And is, in fact, our perception of ourselves having this capacity itself illusory? Can you demonstrate that? Given the fact that many times you pursue an outcome and you don't achieve it. Other times you pursue the outcome and you do perceive it and you do achieve it. So therefore, maybe, in fact, your entire view of rationality is illusory. I don't think it is, but given the basis of his worldview, it's very hard to demonstrate that it isn't.
Happened here, no doubt happened, or probably happened in other parts of the universe.
And do you distinguish between intelligence and consciousness?
And great question. Because, of course, when you get to Brett Weinstein talking to Jonathan Peugeot, well, it's all consciousness.
It's absolutely normative sense. And I'll tell you, at the end of this, I hope you'll see where it came from.
All right, okay.
Okay, so all those creatures, every creature, and presumably every creature on every other planet where there are creatures, which I assume there are, has the same purpose, to get their informational stuff lodged as deeply in the future as possible.
Now pay attention. Remember Wolfgang Smith. Where does the measurement, the observation of this purpose? Now, he said it's not in the system. There's no purpose in the system. We bring purpose to the system. Well, where do we get it? Well, we're one level up, looking down at it.
But the ways in which one can lodge one's informational stuff, in our case, our genes, deeply into the future, vary tremendously. That's what biological diversity is, right? It's a diversity of tools for getting genes into the future. the tool that we were awarded that made humans truly special is consciousness, right? What does consciousness do?
Now again, why use that word? Why not use rationality? Is your dog not conscious? Well, my dog has a degree of rationality. He can sort of find the food bowl and tries to please me. Chris Arnatti just recently posted on Twitter a really cool video of he's feeding a turtle, this big snapping turtle coming up out of a swamp or something, and the snapping turtle now sits there and waits for him because he knows that the hot dog is coming. So, well, what exactly are we talking about? And why is this connected to this word consciousness?
Consciousness, I believe, allows us to take two minds and to pool their different understanding of the world, their different kinds of expertise.
Okay, so now he's even going up levels of consciousness.
And to basically asymmetrically parallel process difficult puzzles that neither of us could solve together. And then you can scale that up and you can have a whole campfire of people parallel processing difficult problems like how do we survive in this new habitat that our ancestors didn't know anything about, right? That's a tool. It's a means to an end. And the end is let's get our genes as deeply into the future as possible. However,
which of course is not in the system itself, but he always locates it in the system. But then if you ask, he'll say, no, but it's not really in the system. There's no purpose in the system. There's no intentionality in the system. There's no rationality in the system. But consciousness is always sort of this, there it is.
For this purpose, no.
Okay, for this purpose, no.
Probably happened in other parts of the universe.
And do you distinguish between intelligence and consciousness?
For this purpose, no.
Okay, for this purpose, no.
Yes.
Okay, so let me ask you this question then. Do you think that sexual selection is mediated by consciousness/intelligence?
In those species that have consciousness, yes. I mean,
then I would ask you, to what degree do you think that consciousness operates as a fundamental mechanism of selection and shaping? Because
I mean, that is a very profoundly interesting question. And I mean, sexual selection happens in insects, which I do not think are conscious. And
that's a tough one. I mean, I know butterflies can detect a deviation from symmetry in their partners at the part of 1 in a million.
So there is sexual selection throughout the animal kingdom, and consciousness
can happen without consciousness.
I think so. Yes.
But let's look
in humans. Yes, I should think so.
Okay. So when I look at religious epistemology cross-culturally, I see a bipartite structure at the bottom of the hypothesizing. There's an idea that there's a material substrate that consists of a kind of latent potential. That might be one way of looking at it. And that there's the action of a forming process on top of that. And it looks to me like it's something like, what would you call?
So in other words, you've already got a layer. You've got sort of this dumb matter, and then you've got this other process on topping that is colonizing and employing that matter in order to achieve something.
Call it an intuitive apprehension of the relationship between consciousness and the rise to complexity of living forms. And the reason that I'm curious about that from an evolutionary perspective is that I can't see how forget about unconscious sexual selection for a minute. We'll just parse that off, because maybe there are gradations of consciousness. I don't know. Insects do some damn complex things. And have you ever seen that BBC clip of the pufferfish making a sculpture?
Oh yes, I think I have. Yes,
I mean, that's quite something, because that pufferfish is...
We should talk on the way to the chapel. We can do that.
Okay. Well, it's hard.
We should talk on the way to the chapel. Yes, you should. Where are you going? You're going to the chapel. Oh, is that just a room like any other room?
Day to talk to Penrose and you at the same day.
I know. Yes.
So I don't think it's completely out of the realm of question that part of the apprehension that there's a spirit that gives rise to material order is a metaphysical reflection of the idea that consciousness shapes biological being through sexual selection.
But that spirit would have to have been around before evolution got started. And
Listen to that again.
so you,
Of the eyes to question that part of the apprehension that there's a spirit that gives rise to material order is a metaphysical reflection of the idea that consciousness shapes biological being through sexual selection.
but that spirit would have to have been around before evolution got started.
Yes, it would.
And so you got to.
Well, fair enough.
It's a big thing.
Yes,
Yeah, it's a big thing.
that's a big problem. But then,
Why is it a problem? It's a problem because of your worldview. It's not a problem because it seems to be true.
I guess a rejoinder to that, in some sense, would be, do you think it's a nonsensical proposition to... I mean, one of the things I was talking to Dr. Penrose today about was he believes that consciousness, in some sense, stands outside the domain of algorithmic computation.
I know he does, yes.
And we discussed in some detail why he believes that. And I'm very curious about that. My brother-in-law is probably the world's foremost that he thinks will have the computational power of a human brain. And he was the first person to build a 64-bit chip, and he did that in 1985.
Okay.
And so we've had a lot of discussions about the limits of AI. So this is an AI-optimized chip, by the way.
Yes. This is
And my brother-in-law thinks that
And no, what do we mean by AI? Don't we mean something that can, in a sense, do exactly like we do? Go one level up to measure? That's what we ask Google Photos to do. I put in, it categorizes all of the pictures of me, and I'll put my name in, and then all the pictures of my wife and my mother, and even my pet, and so it's attempting to measure, and to something fairly, and to distinguish. And I mean, that's what we've been talking about in terms of intelligence.
computation is algorithmic, and so it's that thought is computation and algorithmic, and that can be replicated in AI systems.
Yeah.
Penrose thinks that Gödel's theorem precludes that there has to be something standing outside.
Yes.
Now, I tried to push him on what he regarded as the metaphysical significance of consciousness.
Yes.
And he's a very careful thinker. He's a lot like you, except he's more associational in his thinking, I would say, and he thinks in images.
He does.
Fundamentally. Do you think in words?
Yes.
Yes, and I think in words mostly, but
Yes.
but images have quite a hold on me as well, as you pointed out. Do you think that the proposition that consciousness is implicit in matter is a useful and nonsensical statement?
I think it's nonsensical, and I don't think that's what Roger said.
No, it isn't.
Yeah.
No, it isn't. He
So in other words, panpsychism.
didn't say that.
No.
But I suppose it depends to some degree on what you mean by implicit, right? But obviously matter can give rise to consciousness.
With sufficient complexity.
Obviously. Really? Is that in fact obvious? And then we're sort of back into Rupert Sheldrake questions of, is the sun conscious? How complex an electrical system is the sun?
Yes.
But not, I mean, people say things like consciousness is even in stones and
Yes,
atoms.
I know. I've talked to the
That is
panpsychist
nonsense,
types.
yeah.
Well, it just strikes me that it doesn't really help answer the question.
Yes.
So,
Hello.
How did it go?
I think very well.
You both.
You need to take our
May
microphones.
I'll just.
And then that's the end. But again, I start at the end because there's some. Now, having heard that, let's go back to the middle where well, we can sort of get at some of these things. Okay, one of the big points in this that Dawkins sort of hits him with early on is a comment that Peterson must have made in one of his classroom lectures about symbolism of two snakes intertwined as, in a sense, expressing the double helix of genetics. And of course, Dawkins scoffs at this, and, well, it leads to some interesting places.
In that particular lecture, that shows, I hope I can remember this exactly right. So it's this intertwined underlying serpentine structure giving rise to a female and male form.
Yes.
And it's portrayed that way in the cosmogonic myth, that these forms emerge out of this underlying helical structure. But there are stories like that everywhere. And so you might say, well, it's a case of false pattern recognition, and that's really a problem, right? That's the problem of misperception.
Okay, no, wait, I have no problem with, my big problem is equating it with DNA. That's bullshit. However, what might be interesting would be a commonality between myths all around the world, and then
Okay, now I hope it's in this section because I listened to the whole thing, and then we'll keep going.
Anthropologists argue about whether this is because of cross-infection of ideas or whether there's something Jungian about the and I think that's a genuinely interesting question.
Of course it is.
And it
Most of the affective neuroscientists that I've met, the good ones, are tilted pretty hard towards the biological primitive argument, that there are forms of perception.
Yes.
Well, color is one of them.
Well, I think that's interesting. And of course, the coincidence of an image or a statue in this part of the world and that part of the world, you should think about how improbable it is that two people might have hit upon the same design. I mean, the idea of a snake spiraling around each other, it's not that difficult to think of. It wouldn't be ridiculously improbable that two tribes on opposite sides of the world would independently come upon that.
And it might not point to anything particular, except that it is the use of snakes. I would say, though, the idea of that coiled snake, or the dual coiled snake, is also a powerful symbol of healing. And so that's partly why it's used as the symbol for physicians. Yes, exactly. Sure. And there is the idea that's part and parcel of that, and this would be, let's say, separate from the DNA idea. Snakes shed their skin, and they're reborn. And so that's part of the reason why they're symbols of
like a phoenix.
Transformation. Exactly. And that notion of death and regeneration is obviously central to the idea of healing. And so that's another explanation for the use of the snake.
Okay, so I'm interested in the improbability of coincidence in this case. Now, if, say, people in Scandinavia and people in the Amazonian jungle had independently developed an alphabet, which was the same alphabet. Now that would be impressive. I mean, that would be goodness.
Yes. Well, but it's also equally impressive that separated people did develop alphabets.
Yeah, but not the same alphabet.
No, I know they didn't use, but there's a level at which it's the same, right? Because they are alphabetic, and they are the use of written forms to represent sounds.
Well, that's a sensible thing to have, and it's such a good idea that.
Okay, it's a sensible thing to have. Why? Well, because the world has a shape. The world has patterns, and certain patterns are higher than other patterns. Certain things work better than other things. Well, what do we mean work? They achieve the outcomes that are desired by these reasonable, conscious beings that are doing something that, for example, Richard Dawkins would say, rivers and stones and inorganic things are not doing.
It wouldn't be improbable that two tribes would have the same idea.
That's true, but it gets complicated.
But you have to ask what above is sort of, I would say, pulling those tribes up towards that idea. So they're pushing below, but there's also pulling up.
Too. Well, it gets complicated in the context of this argument, because one of the debates that Foucault had that was famous was a debate with Chomsky.
Yes.
And Foucault, of course, is a radical social constructionist, except when he isn't, now and then, right? And I'm not being smart about that. The Order of Things is quite a careful book. But Chomsky was laying out a more archetypal argument in some sense, and Chomsky thinks that there is something like an underlying language grammar, and so the fact that an alphabetic structure might be discovered by two separate peoples would be partly a reflective of an underlying biological commonality. Yes. And so it is very difficult to draw a border between these. And I would also say, I agree with you completely that associative thinking of the kind that you just read to me can go far astray. What that is false pattern recognition.
He read a radical feminist author that basically was saying that all rationality is, there's just whole ranges of rationality in science are corrupt because they are based on the penis, and therefore the erectile structure of all of those systems downstream of that will be rigid and can never understand fluid dynamics like a moist vagina. And both of them are like, yeah, this is kind of just random symbolic associations.
You know, so it's the apperception or perhaps the projection of a pattern onto a background, let's say an underlying reality, that actually isn't characterized by that pattern. But that's actually part of the dilemma of thought, though, too, isn't it? Because, like, I think thought is usefully parceled out into a revelatory element and a dialogical element. And so the revelatory element is, well, you're sitting there and thoughts enter the theater of your imagination. And so it's in a sense, phenomenologically, like they sort of spring up from the void. And you can be struck by a thought, which is really interesting, right? It's like,
I agree.
Well, it's your thought. Why are you struck by it?
Where does it come from?
Yes, that's it. No kidding. Where does it come from? But then there's another element, which is, well, not all intuitions are valid, the things that strike you, even though being struck is often a pretty good indication that there's something there, but it's not always an indication. And there are certain forms of psychopathology, schizophrenia in particular. Schizophrenia is characterized by the misfiring of that intuition system. So, for example, partly what happens to people who have...
This I find interesting because I know so many schizophrenics.
Like ideas of reference. They'll be watching television, and the latent inhibition will get stripped away from their perception of the voices. And so now the voices become magnified in significance. And
now, underneath this is, of course, the common assumption that we all share, even if it seems some people have systems that don't justify this assumption, that schizophrenics are not actually seeing the world straight. And those without schizophrenia are seeing the world at least straighter. That, in fact, there is right and wrong association. There is better and worse association. And this association is within us a product of a number of systems that have to actually work together properly in order to achieve these associations. In other words, it's an achievement. It's a psychological achievement. It's a biological achievement, but it's also an ontological achievement.
And to account for the magnification of emotional significance, they start thinking, the television has a special message for me. It's like the receipt of a religious revelation, and it's often accompanied by religious ideation. So it's not that uncommon, although it's somewhat uncommon, for people who are floridly schizophrenic to identify with Christ.
Sounds to me very like religious revelation.
It is very like.
But I wanted to counter because you characterize yourself as religious sometimes, and yet you don't seem to believe in a supernatural creator.
Well, people have,
okay. Well, here's that word. Well, okay. Let's deal with that word a little bit. Supernatural. Well, what do we mean? Again, you can go back to C.S. Lewis's book Miracles. We mean something other than a system which is locked into emergent, predictable cause and effect from below, 100% nothing else. And that's exactly where you wind up with the problem of rationality. Because where does rationality come from? And again, Lewis makes this point in Miracles. Alvin Plantinga makes this point. I forget who Lewis quotes in making this point. Was it Haldane? That this point has been made again and again and again and again. That although you do have systems which rise up within, emerging from the pattern, why do we say that the schizophrenic's system, which is also emerging up, just as the non-schizophrenic system is emerging up, why do we say that the person without schizophrenia arrives at the proper answer, whereas the person who is schizophrenic does not? In order to do that, you have to jump, again, a level up in terms of evaluating both outcomes. And as someone who has spoken with many schizophrenics, my word against theirs, I see, all kinds of crazy ideas about Henry Waxman's daughter, because this one particular schizophrenic went to school with Henry Waxman's daughter, and I heard a lot about Henry Waxman's daughter from this one schizophrenic. And then my perception. Well, they're both emerging. On what basis can we say one is right and one is wrong? Lewis will say, if it's all only emergent and everything is locked into this cause and effect from below, there is no measuring the straight stick. The straight stick has to come from measurement from above in order to evaluate my view of the world versus my friend who went to school with Henry Waxman's daughter. How? Where? You don't get it from below. It comes from above.
Whether you do or not.
All the time.
I know they do.
Whether I believe in God, and I say, well, I act as though God exists.
Yes, but
which is a reference to this model idea.
Last night, you seem to be. We come to the idea of truth. Where you seem to be saying that which is beneficial to humanity, or to your reduce your anxiety, or makes you feel good, or reduces stress, is true.
Okay, now Dawkins is a little bothered because it almost sounds like, now pay attention here, we're going to be knocking on Descartes' door, that in a sense there's this internal self, which maybe has its own self-validation, a sense of true, versus an external self that says we have an evaluative process which says we know that something is true. And these are in some ways for Dawkins two separate systems, and one is illusory and the other is not. But again, if it's all coming up from below, it's me versus the guy who went to school with Henry Waxman's daughter. You need to come from it from above in order to evaluate the two things. Now again, what you're going to find is that truth, as we imagine it, as you'll hear a bit later, is sort of an implicit observer watching all of the steps of emergence from below, saying that each one is correctly cited. But they're measured, each one of them. So again, we're back into the same trap. You wind up in this trap again and again and again and again. You can't avoid it.
And no. It's more than that. And good, I'm glad.
That which is beneficial to humanity, or to your reduce your anxiety, or makes you feel good, or reduces stress, is true. And
No. It's more than that. And good, I'm glad that we're on to this part of this discussion. When Darwin first published his biological treatise, The Origin of Species, the New England pragmatists got a hold of his manuscript, William James and C.S. Peirce. And William James founded experimental psychology, and C.S. Peirce was probably the most profound philosopher the Americans ever produced. And they had a club, the
Metaphysical Club.
I think it was the Psychological Club. It was either that or the Philosophical Club, but I believe it was the Psychological Club. And they believed that Darwin's theorizing required a new epistemology. It was so revolutionary. And Peirce in particular, developed pragmatism. And pragmatism is like an engineering truth claim. And
it's if you read the book, it's based on statistics and probability, as because their telescopes weren't good enough.
I don't think you can be an evolutionary biologist without being a pragmatist. I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's coherent conceptually. And so Peirce was trying to solve the problem of, well, how can something be true when we're fundamentally ignorant about everything in the final analysis? And the answer was, well, we have truths that are true enough. And you might say, well, what do you mean true enough? And the answer would be, they're true enough to be used as tools to achieve a certain end in a certain space over a certain time period. And so your truth is true enough if it gets you from point A to B when you're using it. The tool is adequate for the job if it performs the task intended. And for Peirce...
Now again, but you also see how this rationality, this consciousness, this thing that we're trying to describe, this intentionality, is built into that, to the thing that's intended. Again, that's a level up. It's where the measurement is, because in order to know whether or not you're achieving what you've intended, you have to get above the physics and look at it and evaluate it.
And the pragmatists, that was it. There was no truth superordinate to that. Now, it's complicated because some pragmatic truths are functional across broader spans of time and space than others. So they're more like ultimate truths. But this was not a grounding of truth in a Newtonian idea or Cartesian idea, or even in an idea of objective truth, because they derived their concept of truth from their analysis of the evolutionary process. And they said, and I really want to know what you think about this. It's like, say, there's truth in the human form. Well, I'll speak metaphorically. But biologically, that truth only suffices for like 90 years, right? We're good enough. We're good enough as a model.
It may be that our knowledge of truth is incomplete and
Now, this is a really interesting moment, because it may be that our knowledge of truth, but now you're going to go ahead and claim something that you've just said you don't or may not be able to have. And this is a classic move to the monarchical vision. This is just a classic move to it. Because on one hand, well, we might not know the truth, but here it is. It's like, well, wait a minute. You just said you might not know it. And then you say that you do have it. So which is it?
we can never be sure of anything, but that doesn't mean there isn't truth out there.
Well,
so we may never be sure that we have it, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Well, I can make that argument about God, can't I? I mean, what kind of an argument is that, really?
truth is a slippery concept because it can be used very many ways. And I'm not trying to, believe me, I'm not trying to bandy words about.
Okay, he's arguing in good faith, and I think he is.
I do not believe that the Newtonian conception of truth and the evolutionary conception of truth are commensurate. And I think the evolutionary, because, well, it's tough, right? Because you might think, well, when you're talking about truth, are you talking about the nature of ultimate reality, or are you talking about the relationship of your models to that reality? Right?
I don't know that I care too much about that, because
Listen to that question again, because it's a good one.
Reality, or when you're talking about truth, are you talking about the nature of ultimate reality, or are you talking about the relationship of your models to that reality?
Are you talking about the nature of ultimate reality? Is that, when you're using that word, is that what you're referring to? Even after you've just made some of the skeptical remarks you have? Or are you talking about the veracity of your model as it relates to that reality that, as you just said, well, is you're asserting that it's there, even though you're at the same time asserting that you can't know it?
Right?
I don't know that I care too much about that, because I mean...
Now, who's the pragmatist?
Let me tell you something that is true.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Well, lay it on us.
We are we are cousins of chimpanzees.
We are? We are cousins of chimpanzees? I know what a cousin is. This is his truth statement. I know what cousins are. These are cousins. There's me and my cousin John and my cousin Mel. They're sitting right next to me, and we love the dinner rolls, and we're sitting there probably after church on a Sunday, or maybe it was, I'm trying to see if there's any snow outside. Might have been, oh yeah, Auntie Gladdy had a point set out, so it was probably Christmas dinner with the cousins. I know what cousins are, and I know what chimpanzees are. I don't see any chimpanzees in the picture. If we put this in a CAPTCHA, it'd be like, click all the pictures that have chimpanzees in them. But I know that's true, that chimpanzees are our cousins. Now, again, I'm not trying to make some creationist argument here, but how on earth does language work if this is his ultimate truth claim? Truth is a very slippery thing.
Yes.
That is objectively true.
That is objectively true.
And another thing that's true is that the Earth orbits the Sun.
Yes.
These are not.
Didn't you just ask about the system being true or the veracity of our model? I think he's going for the veracity of his models.
One can argue about the epistemology of that, but I want to be a realist about this and say that there may be kinds of truth which are somehow filtered through our Darwinian past and which influence the way we see truth, and we may be deceived by all sorts of things. We may be self-deceived, but there are objective truths. It is the business of science to find them, and science has tools for stripping off subjective bias, for stripping off self-deception.
Yes.
And
I don't know that the tools of science are going to help me recognize a chimpanzee in this photo. And again, I'm not trying to make a creationist argument here. I'm just noting the nature of language and the examples that he chooses.
And that's why we do double-blind trials
Absolutely.
in medicine.
It's why we
so
use random assignation to group as
yes.
well.
Yes.
Absolutely. Okay. Right. And who can argue with the power of the scientific process? But I would also say that the religious people that you've debated, they lose before they open their mouths, because they don't notice that you impose this realist metaphysics on the argument before it starts. Now, I'm not saying that you're not justified in doing that. I'm not saying that, because that's open to question. But I am saying they don't notice that that's what's happened. But there's a problem here. It's a real problem. And this is the postmodern conundrum, I would say. It's useful and true to say that there are objective facts. But the problem is, and
again, you might want to define that a little bit, because I don't think supernatural, objective, I don't think these words are actually going to get you where you want to go. We could say public facts, and I'm not denying that there are facts, and I'm not even, it's just that, okay, objective doesn't help you if you can't see the world objectively. You say, they're out there. I mean, that's exactly what Dawkins says. They're out there. Okay, good. They're out there. But how do you know? Now, I think you do know, but how?
Infinite number of them.
True.
Okay, so but the problem is, there's an infinite number of them.
True.
Okay, so now the question is,
why did you use the word cousins? Why did you use the word cousins? Because again, I know what cousins are. Here I am with my cousins. I know what cousins are. Why cousins? There's many words out there you could have used. Why that one?
As a scientist, how do you decide which facts to attend to? And the answer to that is you cannot do that using the scientific process.
No, that's true.
Okay, so then the question is, look, I've done a lot of statistical analysis of data sets in my time.
Let's take a look at this other thing.
This goes into the core of my sort of scientific work, which is the work I do on relevance realization. How can I summarize this in like a couple of sentences? Here's what the AI revealed. What's the problem? And it was a problem that is masked by the success of our meaning-making machinery, by our intelligence. See, the thing that our embodied brain, as it's dynamically coupled to the environment, does is render things obvious to us, and people therefore think that the explanation just comes from that obvious. Well, how do I categorize? I just look out and notice that some things are similar, and
Our cousins are chimpanzees. How do we categorize?
group them together, and then I keep the dissimilar things outside of the category. What could be easier than that? Right. And then tell me what you're doing when you're doing similarity. Because if you mean a list of shared properties, this is a point Goodman brought out, any two objects have an indefinitely long list of truly shared properties. A plum and a lawnmower, are they similar? Well, they both have shiny surfaces. They both contain carbon. They both have an odor. Neither one existed 300 million years ago. Both are found in North America. Neither one makes a particularly good weapon, etc., etc., etc. And you go, oh, well, I don't mean those. And then I say, oh, but they're true. And you go, yeah, but they're not the relevant. Oh, what? And how do you know what the relevant factors are for comparison? So this is at the guts of categorization. And then you're tempted to say, well, it's obvious because of the context. And then I'll say, what do you mean by context? And you'll say, how things are relevant to a particular problem. Oh, and what's a problem? Is a problem a state of affairs in the world? Well, no, that's not quite right. Is it a state of affairs in your head? No, a problem is a way in which you're not fitting reality. So your brain is...
Problem is a way that reality is not fitting with your desire, with the outcome. The way something is impeding your pursuit, your rational pursuit of an outcome that you desire. It's something in the way that you want to move.
Trying to evolve dynamically how to be appropriately fitted to this situation to solve some problem, and what it's doing is trying to determine, out of all of the information, and now this is the other part of it, the amount of information. Think of all of what you could pay attention to right now. You could pay attention to the number of green books behind you right now. You could do that. You could pay attention to whether or not your right big toe is a little bit warmer than your left big toe. You could do that. And it's obvious that I shouldn't do that right now. Yeah, but how do I give that to a machine? Out of all of the information available to it, and now more,
because now why do we bump into this when we're looking at AI? What are we doing with this machine? We're building it from the ground up. We're programming it. And why is it that, in a sense, in order to create AI, we had to stop building it from the ground up and, in a sense, give it capacities and send it out into the world to do what? Well, in some ways, be shaped from above.
Of all of the information in long-term memory and all the possible ways you could combine it, of all the different thoughts you could have above and beyond what you pay attention to, and of all of the different sequences of behavior you could put together, you zero in on the relevant information, and you're doing it, and you're categorizing things, and it's all happening in a way that fits together and fits you to the world.
And we all say the schizophrenic is not.
And the world discloses itself to you in such a way that you can causally interact with it in a perspicacious and largely successful manner. That's the problem. And so what Plato is trying to, I think, get us to see is we need, well, I would say we need to realize on Plato's behalf that that question is a question that bears tremendous reflection. Instead of being satisfied with the obviousness of our intelligibility, step back, and this is what cognitive science does, and call it seriously into question. Because when you try and give that ability to a machine, you realize, oh, wow, I don't know how we do this. And then Plato's trying to say, okay, now look, there's bottom-up aspects to this. Let's just do your attention. Just do your attention. Mm-hmm. Because part of what you have to do is you're paying attention to what's relevant or irrelevant. Now, part of your attention is bottom up. If I clap my hands, that's salient and grabs your attention. But notice you can make things salient by directing your attention top down. How's your left shoulder doing? Oh, now it's salient to me. There's a bottom up and top down. You see this when people are reading, right? All of that's going on simultaneously. This is what I mean. The bottom up, top down.
He uses the reading. He talks about that in the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. In a sense, when you read, you're sort of going along the line and you're finishing the words before you know the words, but you're doing this completely without even seeing it. You just see the words.
Complexity of how the intelligibility evolves. I think people don't realize. That's why it is so impressive, and that's why and how I think Plato's thought can be so relevant. Sorry, I went on for a bit there, but
time. And when I was a naive undergraduate, and I'm not particularly mathematically gifted, by the way, statistics was quite a slog for me until I started to understand it conceptually, and then I started to enjoy it. But I kind of imagined that the data contained the information. The statistical process was an algorithm to reduce the data to the information, and it was kind of a mechanistic process. I didn't realize at all that a data set is, imagine I've had data sets that had, 5,000 participants and 200 rows of variables. It's like, there's a lot of information in that data set. And so then the question is, how the hell do you derive a valid conclusion from that plethora of information? Because you could report all sorts of meaningless correlations, right? They would be spurious, but also practically useless. And there's just endless numbers of those in the data set. How do you judiciously use a statistical process to extract out the information that is what? True? Yes, but it's not just true. You want it to be useful.
I agree. Yes.
Right. Okay. So that's where
and useful. You got to take that another layer up. Useful in terms of what? An outcome, a desired outcome. And we're not even sure what the desired outcome is. I loved my conversation with Rick Rapetti, but what we bumped into there is what we bump into all the time in religion, in pastoral care is, okay, well, what do you want? Well, Rick Rapetti was a great example of, he's had all sorts of out-of-body experiences, lucid dreams, been up to the Platonic forms, done all of that. The definition of a trip is you come back. Do you want to live up there? I can't. Look at, who was it? Was it Finney? I don't remember if it might have been Dwight Moody. Might have been Charles Finney. I don't remember which one, but Tim Keller uses this illustration of God came upon him in such a way that he had to ask God to relent because he was just being consumed by his love, and it was just simply too much. Well, what exactly do we want? Because we don't just want rapture, enthrallment. We want the world set right. But even if we ask for the world set right, we don't even know exactly all the details of that, and we can't even choose if this right would be better for or that right. And I mean, it's just simply not there. We don't even know what we want. We're that lost. And I think part of the present meaning crisis is also that we have so much. It's part of it is affluenza, and it's like, well, I no longer have to struggle for my food or work for my shelter, and well, now it's just I just don't have any purpose.
Where the pragmatism issue comes in, right? Because then we might say, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is because I know you care deeply about truth, and I know that you're motivated by it. And so then I would say that's a metaphysical relationship in some sense. It's an a priori metaphysical relationship because you made a commitment to truth. And I would also say that that's an act of faith, because you might ask yourself, in science, is it truth or untruth that serves the world?
Well, that's where we came back. That's where we came in, because there are all sorts of truths which do not serve the world. There are all sorts of truths which are very unpleasant.
Yes.
An analogy might be, as a doctor, you have a patient who has incurable cancer, and you have to decide whether to tell that patient the truth or not.
Right.
Well, you might debate this with your colleagues. And,
you might, yes.
Your colleagues might say, well, it's better off not telling him. He's better not knowing. So,
but now pay attention. We've sort of, there's all these different little truths. Okay, what exactly? But there is a bigger truth that is in fact weighing on your decision as to whether or not to tell. And what is that bigger truth? It is this sense of well-being, or care, or love. It is that thing that we can't name about this world set right. It is that thing that is actually guiding you, and it's not the truth about the incurable cancer. Now, what you have is a prognosis, and it's really amazing that, Peterson doesn't talk about his wife at this moment, because isn't that exactly what was told her? And it was told her.
The truth in this case is not beneficial.
What would you pick? What would you?
Well,
would you want to know?
That's irrelevant.
No.
I would want to know.
You would want to know.
I would want to know.
Okay. Well, but I agree that there are dangerous truths, let's say, and there are truths that, under some circumstances, might be harmful and that could be used as weapons. But I would still say, I don't believe that you can be a scientist and discover objective truth, say, in a useful manner, without being committed to a metaphysical vision of the redeeming power of the truth.
Right. We'll see what he's just sort of brought in there. A metaphysical vision. This is all this rationality. This is all this stuff from above that says the world ought to be a better place. It's a world we've never known. The world ought to be a better place. It's C.S. Lewis's argument from Desire at the beginning of Mere Christianity. The world ought to be a better place. Therefore, well, should we tell them the truth? Well,
because I don't even think you can make the micro decisions that you're making while you're reading a book and sifting through it, right? Trying to separate the wheat from the chaff without, I don't want to impose this view on this conversation, right? I'm trying to explore it because I've dealt with plenty of bad scientists in my time. Psychology is rife with what they call...
Now pay attention. He's going to have a definition of what is a bad and what is a good scientist.
P-hacking, where you just run repeated correlations until you find one that...
Yeah. Oh, that's bad science.
Yes, but it's also bad, but it's bad ethics. It's like, well, why not? Look, why not do that if it advances your career?
Yes, I'm quite.
And exactly what is good science? And Vervaeke talks about this in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. What does a scientist do? Does a scientist go out there and say, I'm going to go find some truth today? Well, hey, wait a minute. Look what I found. Well, I'll use the cell phone stand. I found the cell phone stand. truth. Yeah, it is. It's not terribly interesting. What does a scientist do? A scientist usually has a hypothesis. Well, what goes into that hypothesis? A whole bunch of relevance realization. Does the scientist want to find out the exact temperature of those lights, of this light that is shining on me? It's like, well, that's a rather boring thing to find out. I might speculate as to what it is, and that makes it a little interesting. In fact, all the interest has to do with the scientist's vision of the world and the vision of the good, and maybe a perspective on a problem being the impediment to achieving something that the scientist desires, and the good scientist imagines that the thing that they propose is good. But again, nothing you can get out of that just comes from the stuff. That's the point of the combinatorial explosive thing of the lawnmower and the plum. You don't get that from the plum. You don't get that from the physics. It comes from somewhere else. And that's exactly what Peterson's point is making here, saying that, a bad scientist just looks at all these data sets and says, well, there's some truth. I'll just pluck it out there. The good scientist says, well, these people are suffering, and suffering is bad. Well, some suffering is bad and some suffering is good. And the wise parent, the wise clinician, the wise friend has an understanding of, well, we're going to let them suffer here in order to achieve this good, because this good is more important than that suffering. And you see, there's this entire vision. There's this entire world that is above the physics of it. That you cannot derive from the physics of it, that you cannot derive just from sort of following the breadcrumbs of the rationality. The schizophrenic watches, Henry Waxman's daughter. Why do I use that illustration? Because I can't tell you how many times this individual, we'd had men's Bible study here at church, and he would come and he wanted the soda, and he just wanted to be around other people who would treat him humanely, and he'd sit there in the terms of the Bible study, and we'd be talking about a book of the Bible, and it was just sort of like word association in the Bible study. And at some point he would hear something, and then he would ramble about it for a few minutes. He was fairly well behaved in our midst of many other stories. But at some point in the Bible study, Henry Waxman's daughter would come up, and God bless Henry Waxman's daughter. I've never met her, but somehow we all know that, well, even he is not the way he's supposed to be, even though he's completely emergent. He's completely emergent. It's just all emerged from the bottom up, him and his schizophrenia. And yet we say, it's not the way it's supposed to be. It's a view from above. You're not going to get at it all from below.
That's bad, and that's not, I think, what
Not do that if it advances your career.
Yes, I'm quite. That's bad, and that's not, I think, what we're talking about. I thought you were saying that truth is that which is beneficial. In my analogy, when you're arguing with your colleagues whether to tell this patient the truth, you could very well argue, shall we tell him or shall we not? It would be beneficial not to or beneficial to. But everybody should agree that it is true that this man has cancer. That is true.
Yes, yes. Well, this is partly why this issue.
Yeah, in almost every case within even this own illustration, is it true that this person will die? Well, now we're back into the land of probability, aren't we? But if we're back in the land of probability, then we're not in the land of certainty, are we? Is it, well, there's a 99.99% chance. Is it 100%? Well, I'll tell you something. There's 100% the person is going to die. What you're really talking about is when and how. But even the when and how, you don't know. And trust me, I've been with a lot of patients and a lot of doctors, and almost always the family will say when, and the honest doctors will say, we don't know. Soon. Well, what does soon mean? 1 day, 2 days, 5 days? And they'll try and bring some comfort to the family by giving them at least some time frame. Just because we don't like uncertainty. But again, pay attention. Pay attention to what we're talking about here.
It was so unbelievably complicated because what you just said is true. But it's also the case that you have to apply an ethical framework onto that infinity of truths in order to focus on and communicate those. See, you've picked topics that you communicate to people. And there are other topics you didn't pick.
Yes.
And there's most of the other topics you didn't pick. And so the question to me is, and this is partly why I got interested in Jung, by the way, because he was very interested in the unconscious direction of attention. The psychoanalysts were fascinated by that. That's partly why they were interested in Freudian slips. But okay, so one thing we could ask. Do you think that you picked your field of study, or did it pick you?
See why this is a good conversation? Moments like this, darn good.
I'm not sure, but I don't think...
Now, if in fact you were consistent, you would say fields of studies cannot make selections. The universe cannot make a selection. There's no such thing out there that can make a selection. Sam Harris. The whole show dictates that I would always be this. Because it's just everything up coming from the bottom.
I think that's not relevant. It doesn't. It
is. No, but it is.
Relevant, you say?
Has to be relevant because it's actually the question of relevance. And so there's a whole branch of cognitive science now. I'd like to have you talk to this colleague of mine named John Vervaeke. John Vervaeke is unbelievably smart. And the problem he spent his whole career focusing on is, how in the world do you decide what you attend to when there's an almost infinite number of things to attend to?
That's a big question.
It's a huge question.
And it's a question that applies to science when you decide what to work on. As you say, there's an infinite number of things you could attend to, work on, and you choose some of them. And that's a decision which people take, and that biases your view of the world and everything. But nevertheless, there is objective truth. That doesn't affect the fact there's objective truth. The mere fact that there's a very large number of things you could attend to and you have to choose one of them doesn't affect the fact that there are lots of truths out there. And
right, but it definitely, yes, but it definitely does affect the way that science is. See, this is also why the postmodern critics have been so effective in what they've done. It's because they're pushing the notion that a narrative necessarily drives the process of inquiry, even in relationship to objective facts. And I think that's true. And that's partly what we're discussing.
Okay.
Now, I also think, and I don't know how to reconcile these things, like the fact that you're making a case for the existence of the objective fact. It's like, I'm not going to argue about that. That doesn't mean I understand it fully, because I can't quite understand the relationship between the objective fact and the necessity for utility. And partly I can't understand that on biological grounds. Because fundamentally, when you look at things, I would say that the description of truth that you're purveying right now in this argument, I'm not trying to make it any more general than that, is not one that's well nested inside the epistemology that you would derive from evolutionary biology. Because you would say, in some sense, that we're tilted in a very fundamental manner to only apprehend those things that will aid survival and reproduction. And so...
tilting it in that direction is, I would say, just as biased as the postmodern critique of power. Because we're not just looking to maximize longevity and reproduction. If we were, we would all have 30, 40, 50 kids, and we would be employing all of our medical technology to maximize the number of children that we'd push out into this world. That's another problem with Brett Weinstein's position. He's only had 2 children. I think he has two sons. Again, no criticism. I've had 5. Could my wife and I have had more? Yes. That's not the point. What is the point? We are hungering for something we know not what. It's Hebrews 11. We're hungering for something we know not what. We have intimations of it, intuitions of it. It's driving us. It's driving our science. It's driving our politics. It's driving our relationships. And to just boil it down to propagation of the genetic pool is ludicrous. None of us act that way. We don't act like chimps are our cousins. We don't call each other apes, because if you'd say you're having sex with a chimp, you would be horrified. We don't act this way at all. We're blind to the wisdom that we actually behave with, even if we're not all that wise. And that was part of the point that Wolfgang Smith made, is that at least we're not as dumb as our theories. Thank heavens. But, I mean, Peterson's pressing the point hard here.
To hell
Yes.
with the objective facts.
Well, that's probably true, that our sense organs are biased towards that which helps us to survive, and our internal sense organs, so to speak, our attention mechanisms inside our thought mechanisms. So
It's not mere survival. And it's not mere propagation. We are seeking something. We can't even describe it. You know, it's not simply being lost in a heroin addicts are seeking something, and very quickly they realize they're not going to get it from heroin. People seek it in a spouse. People seek it in a job. People seek it in clothing. People seek it in wealth. People seek it all over the place. And the words of U2, I still haven't found what I'm looking for. Christians seek it. And Christians actually have a little bit more developed language, but sometimes not much better than others who are in the world. And here we are. And we listen to this stuff and say, oh, we're seeking survival. Oh, yes. No, we're not. Pay attention. We're seeking to propagate our genes into the future. We're not acting like Genghis Khan. Pay attention. It's not at all what we're doing. Now, I'm not saying what we're doing is all right, but it's certainly not what they describe us as doing.
we are creatures who evolved on the African savanna and from forests.
Again with the we. I've never been to Africa. What do you mean by we? Well, I mean a lineage. Okay. What aspect of the lineage? Do I act like if you would drop me in the Serengeti, I would probably get with no naked and afraid without the camera crew or a sharpened stick. I would probably lose all of that wisdom that the Bushman has. Watch, the gods must be crazy, and finds a Coke bottle. All the wisdom the Bushman has, I have lost. And yet they keep talking about the fact that, we have suddenly arrived at the Serengeti. And I think if I go there, I'm not looking to have Richard Dawkins or Jordan Peterson be my guide. I'm going to look for the Bushman. This language that we use, what do we mean by it? It's just preposterous.
Earlier on, and our ability to understand the world, let alone what we attend to, is limited by that.
Okay, the world. And again, it's so broad. And again, I know there's utility to this, and I'm not trying to kneecap him or straw man him, but just pay attention to what is being said here.
We are blinkered by the fact that our bodies and our brains were designed to survive in Africa.
Right. Well, and that's what that feminist critic was pointing to in a very, let's look, in an awkward and tendentious manner and an overstated manner. Absolutely. Not as bad as Lacan,
all right,
though.
Well, then, we are living. I don't understand quantum theory. And the reason I don't understand quantum theory from an evolutionary point of view is that I'm not evolved.
It doesn't map onto our bodies well.
Exactly, and I don't. There are. What I think is remarkable, actually, that there are people who understand quantum theory.
I agree.
How do you know? I'm not skeptical that there are people, but the question of how you know is not irrelevant to the question. You know because they seem to achieve something. And again, it's all of this purpose and directionality that so often it's just left out of the system because it's not down here in the lower level. Yet we attribute that to the lower level. The genes want to get into the future.
I mean, that
also points to your point. That also points to our capacity to apprehend truths that in some sense appear to be outside the pure confines of the evolutionary struggle.
Yes.
But then that's also a problem in some ways for evolutionary theory. I mean, you can, wave that off as a spandrel, but
Evolutionary theory would say I should have 20, 30, 40 children, and that would somehow be achieving my purpose. Well, we certainly have gotten way off kilter with these population rates we have now. We're fooling ourselves another way. Well, absolutely, but that still doesn't account for exactly what we're doing, and especially for what we want.
I think that's a big mistake when we're talking about something as profound as the capacity to understand quantum theory.
I wouldn't wave
for
it off
example.
at all. I mean, I think I accept. Steven Pinker says, why should you be so presumptuous as to think you can understand all these things when you're only an animal which has evolved to survive and reproduce?
Right, but
yes, and then answer that question. Why should you? I don't know, you could read in the book of Ecclesiastes something about eternity in our hearts. What on earth does that mean?
But the thing that's so horrible about that, in some sense, is that's also at the core of the postmodern critique of science, that claim. Now, the humanities types, when they make a claim like that, often sound like the woman that you just described. But, I try to give the devil his due. And I'm trying to do that with postmodernism because, I think the conclusions that were drawn from the postmodernist canon, the fundamental conclusion, as far as I'm concerned, of the French postmodernist process, allied with a certain kind of Marxism, is that the entire process of categorization, all our categories, plus the process of categorization.
Remember, I played that clip of Vervaeke about categorization? There's the problem.
Are attributable to the expression of will to power. That's it.
Now, again, back to the power conversation. Is it really power? It's not really power. It's more like, Lewis would call it reason in Miracles. It's more like agency, but it's goal pursuing agency. And to say, that's people are just pursuing it. Well, of course they're pursuing agency, which is why you utter any sentence you ever utter.
Oppression, tyranny, dominance. And there's actually, I would say that the evolutionary biologists are in part responsible for that, weirdly enough.
Wow. And he's right.
I'm not trying to throw stones, I'm like to think of myself, to the degree that I can manage it, as an evolutionary psychologist. I accept the tenets of evolutionary biology. I don't think you can understand anything about biology without doing that. But here's the argument from the biological perspective. We ratchet ourselves up hierarchies of power to attain positions of status, particularly as males, to give us preferential access to mating resources. And that contaminates everything we do. It's like,
as if, again, we were all trying to have 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 children. It's ludicrous.
Hey, now, I want to ask you one final question. I know we're running out of time, but I don't care. I want to ask you this question.
And that's where it is. This is a far better conversation than people are giving it credit for. And it's maybe not let me dial that back. It's maybe not a great conversation, but there's some really good things in here that are really impinging on the big questions that we're dealing with. Because, okay, you can go to
way to get there. Yes, I get it from our human perspective, not the way we would have done it, but I'm always a little careful when I say, well, God should have done this differently because I would have had a better plan. And I'm me and God is God.
Yeah, it's a small point, really. I mean, I think for me a bigger point is not to stress the fact that God is not necessary, and I think He is not necessary. But that's what most people say. I want to go further than to say he's not necessary. Somehow he really, really gets in the way of the fact that the Darwinian explanation so beautifully does away with the need for any kind of top-down design. The Darwinian explanation is a powerful antidote to the feeling that we all have because we're human, that when things are complicated, they need to be put together by somebody in a top-down design kind of way. And if you really understand that the evolutionary process starts with with simplicity and builds up to complexity and elegance and beauty and
without having any understanding of what elegance and beauty really mean from the bottom. Aren't they viewed from the top? So, maybe not a great conversation, but hitting on, I think, what is at the core of Peterson's search. And I think with Peterson, many others are journeying, asking these questions, recognizing that the world we live in, assume and depend upon, does not fit the answers that this group of people are giving. That we, in fact, are seeking, are using capacities and striving for outcomes that physics alone does not give us. That we are viewing the world from above. And even those who say there is no such above, Lewis made this same point in Miracles again and again and again with his interlocutors of the middle of the 20th century, again and again and again. You can read it in The Abolition of Man. You can read it in Miracles. It's the same thing again and again. He has a chimpanzee as a cousin. Really? I don't think so. I think he has human beings as cousins. And the difference between those human beings and chimpanzees is a world of difference. The chimpanzees are not sitting in the jungles of Africa concerned for their own existence. We are concerned for them. It's all in Miracles. Read the book. Anyway, couldn't not talk about this video. I don't know how many more videos I'll have coming out over the next couple of weeks. I will be in Chicago. Come to the event. I'll be in Grand Rapids. Come to those events. Links will be down below in the description. Hope to see you there.